Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Faye Rosenfeld, Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to one of the highlights of our Live from NYPL season, the annual Robert B. Silvers Lecture. The series was endowed by philanthropist and computing pioneer Max Palevsky to honor Robert B. Silvers, the co-founder and longtime editor of the New York Review of Books, as well as a beloved library trustee, a library lion, and a treasured friend of this institution. Since 2002, when Joan Didion delivered the inaugural lecture, the Silvers Lectures have brought some of the most brilliant minds of our time to this stage. Mary Beard, Oliver Sacks, Zadie Smith, Sherilyn Ifill, among others. And tonight's speaker, Timothy Snyder, is clearly no exception. He is the historian of our moment. This series The series reflects not only our deep connection to Bob Silvers, but also to the publication that he helped shape. There is no magazine like the New York Review of Books, fearless, intellectually ambitious, and wholly dedicated to nourishing the minds of readers everywhere. We are proud to house the Review's archive, more than 3,000 linear feet, in our Manuscripts and Archives division. It offers a powerful record of the cultural and political life of the last half-century. And we continue to collect the papers of the Review's contributors. Just last week, we opened the archive of Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn to the public, an extraordinary treasure trove that's now accessible, like all our collections, to everyone. All you need is a library card. You all have library cards, we know that. So just a few quick program notes before we begin. You'll notice free copies of the current issue of the Review are available at the entrance, so please help yourselves. After the lecture, Timothy Snyder will take questions. If you're here in person, please use the note cards that were given to you when you came in. Someone from the staff will come around and collect them. If you're watching online, you could submit them via the chat, or you can send an email to publicprograms@nypl.org. Professor Snyder will be signing copies of his books on freedom and on tyranny, available for purchase here this evening, and proceeds do benefit the library. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce the person who will formally introduce tonight's speaker, the editor of the New York Review of Books, Emily Greenhouse. Emily is a deeply thoughtful and discerning editor, someone who brings intellectual rigor and imaginative breadth to one of our most essential literary and cultural institutions. She's the first woman and the youngest person to serve as sole editor of the Review. Under her leadership, it has remained bold, incisive, and open to a new generation of voices, expanding the conversation and deepening its relevance for our time. In her words, the truth we fight for is the truth about ideas. That spirit lives on in the pages of the Review and in the work of tonight's Silvers lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Emily Greenhouse.
I won't take long. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Greenhouse, and I am the editor of the New York Review of Books. It is my great honor to be here this evening to introduce Timothy Snyder, a visionary contributor to the New York Review, who will deliver the 2025 Robert B. Silvers Lecture, The New Paganism, a framework for understanding our politics. Timothy Snyder holds the inaugural chair in modern European history, supported by the Temerity Endowment for Ukrainian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He is also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and the head of the Academic Advisory Council of Ukrainian History Global Initiative. He is currently on leave from his position as the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and will begin teaching at the Munk School in the 2025 to 2026 academic year. A scholar of the history of Central Europe, Ukraine, the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust, Snyder speaks 5 and reads 10 European languages. He is the author or editor of 20 books published in 40 languages. Snyder writes for the press on Ukraine, the US, authoritarianism, digital politics, health, and education. He has also appeared in documentaries on television and as an expert witness before several parliaments. He has received state orders and decorations, as well as honorary doctorates. Over 20 years, Snyder has contributed dozens of pieces to the New York Review, marked always by a profound expertise and an alarming clarity. Not to mention that his article, Hitler versus Stalin, Who Was Worse, may be our top web hit of all time. I hope you will check it out. His work has inspired demonstrations, sculpture, posters, punk rock, rap, film, theater, and an opera. I described Tim earlier as a visionary. I should say this is not a word I would use lightly. As a historian, as Faye said, the historian of our moment, his examinations of tyranny and freedom in the past and in our world, alas today, provide a kind of mechanism, an instruction guide for opposing authoritarianism. He shows us what is worth fighting for. I can hardly think of a writer whose voice is more vital. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium Timothy Snyder.
Okay, greetings. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Faye. It's a very special pleasure to be here. The other day, I was straightening up some papers in my house, and I reached into my magazine rack, and I got a deep paper cut from an issue of the New York Review of Books. And I immediately took that to mean that I hadn't been writing for the New York Review enough lately, which was all the more reason, one more tiny reason, that I was very happy that Emily reached out and invited me to do this. The deeper reason, of course, that I'm delighted to do this is that this is a lecture in the name of Bob Silvers. Bob was one of the anchors and inspirations of my intellectual life. When one says that, as Emily did, that I wrote a great deal for the New York Review of Books, that is, of course, true, but writing for the New York Review of Books with Bob Silvers as an editor was a matter of never being alone. I've always hated cell phones and all their incarnations. I had, at the time that I wrote a lot for Bob, I had a little black foldy one, which I never answered except when Bob called. And Bob would inevitably call when I was, in the subway or on a bus or doing something else, and it would always be about a semicolon or a factual correction. And these were, and the thing that I've just said, many writers to the New York Review could say, but that was just the superstructure. That was just the epiphenomenal part of the underlying care and concern and expertise and deep knowledge, and ultimately the care of making the writer better, in fact, than he was. So Bob is one of the people I miss the most in this world, and it's a personal honor, a great personal honor for me to be here to give the lecture in his name. And of course, in all of this, you have heard my promise to Emily to write something new. The thing I'm going to try to do in this lecture is deliver an argument which is too weird for the New York Review of Books, and thereby get myself immediately off the hook of this promise. We'll see how it turns out. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to make an argument about the state of our politics, the state of our political world. What I would like to do is not start from the immediacies, although I'll be happy to engage them in Q&A. I have views about all of these things that are happening right now, and I deliver those views very regularly. But what I want to take the opportunity to do here is to try to make a bigger argument about what is actually going on. Why it is, for example, that categories that seemed so important for so long, like rationality or interests, or even the state and the nation, no longer seem to be very important. Why is it that there is so much pain in our politics? Why is it that pain has become normative? Pain has become something that we seek after, something that people have a kind of voyeurism about. Why is it that there are so many negative-sum games? Why is it that we are doing things where everyone involved ends up being worse off at the end? And why is there such a state of futurelessness? Why do we seem to be in a world which is, the Germans have a word for everything, so there's Zukunftslosigkeit, right? Why are we in this world sans avenir? Why is it that there seems like there's just a void in the future? So what I'm going to try to do is be interesting about all of this, and if you'll forgive me, it's all right, I think, if we have a little bit of intellectual enjoyment in all of this. And the reason why I say that is also, well, first of all, if it's not enjoyable, it's not intellectual. But secondly, because there's a political point here, which is that if resistance and opposition is all tedium and repetition, then it won't happen. And the people whom I know personally, who have resisted in difficult conditions over long periods of time, generally have a good attitude about things and are funny in some way. And that's worth keeping in mind, right? That as we resist, we have to be resisting not just in the name of against, but in the name of for. And as we think about what's going on, there should always be at least some pleasure in the thinking. And if there isn't, then we're making a mistake that we ought not to be making. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to try to go beyond this evening, what the New York Review of Books would conceivably publish, and make the case that the way to understand what's happening now is by reference to paganism. So let me make clear what I mean by paganism, because first of all, paganism is one of these words that you're no longer supposed to use. But I can't say pre-Christian because that's terribly anachronistic, and I can't say native religions because I have in mind something much more of an ideal type. I'm going to be referring on and off to early Scandinavia. When I have a moment to do historical work, what I'm trying to do is to write a kind of interpretive history of the lands of what are now Ukraine over the last 7,000 years. And one of the interesting moments is precisely Scandinavia, the pre-Christian pagan Scandinavians and their move to Kiev. So I'm going to be using them as examples here, but I also have in mind paganism as pre-Christian Europe in a much broader sense. The case that I want to make involves thinking about three worlds. This is, for me anyway, and I hope it's for you also, a time when it's permissible and even required to use German words. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of that. I was on Lawrence O'Donnell the other night, and I said 5 German words in a row, which I believe has never happened on MSNBC or any other American television network ever. But I believe that this is the moment, right? So there are many good German words for many things, and when I say nature, what I really have in mind is the German word Umwelt. So the nature as it appears to you, nature as you interact with it, something like environment, but a little richer, and having to do with us as creatures. So I have in mind 3 ideas of nature, and the claim that I'm going to make, and it's kind of a reverse Hegelian claim, is that there was a first nature, and then it's encountering a second nature, and now we're in a third nature. But it's not that the first and second merge to create something better. It's that the first and the second merge to create something worse. So by the first nature, I'm going to have in mind this kind of ideal, typical notion of paganism, where you are involved in I'm just hoping there are no actual historians out there today, by the way, because that was going to be super awkward for me. Like if there are any specialists on 8th century Scandinavian agriculture, I'm going to think the cookies are going to be thrown. Okay, so but just imagine that you're engaged in agriculture and in hunting and you're beginning to be engaged in raiding, which are unpredictable economic activities, all of them in different ways. Hunting, raiding other people, agriculture because of the weather are unpredictable. You're in an era which has been set off, interestingly, by climate change. In the middle of the 6th century, climate change threw everything off. Now you're in this world of unpredictability where you're doing more raiding beyond Scandinavia. You're still carrying out agriculture. But the religion, the system of belief, is about, I would think anyway, it's about handling the inherent unpredictability. You have, the way you deal with nature involves a very light touch. You're not changing nature very quickly or very deeply. You're interacting with nature, but in a way that you can't control and which is unpredictable. And your language, your oracles, your practices of sacrifice, the charisma of your leaders, and your notion of value all reflect that. So that's the first nature that I have in mind. The second nature that I have in mind, which could go by various names, modernity or recorded history or something, or culture, right? The famous notion that our second nature is culture. So I have in mind the period where we have more control of nature. We're still involved in agriculture, but not very many of us have to do it, and the number is shrinking. Fewer and fewer of us are involved directly with the earth in any way. The natural world in terms of fauna, in terms of animals, has been pushed to the extreme margins. We outweigh, and I don't mean this personally in any way, but we outweigh all of the wild animals put together, and our domestic animals vastly outweigh the mammals that are still free in the world, which is a statistic which signifies a kind of control. Religion still exists, but it's been largely pushed out of nature. It's been pushed into temples. It's been contained, and it's about far fewer mysteries. And the key technology, or a key technology at least, involves the hydrocarbons, the natural gas, the oil, the coal, the source of the power of the Industrial Revolution, which during this period of second nature gives a sense of control, The third nature is the period that we have now. And it brings together, I would say, the exhaustion of the second nature and a kind of revival of the first, in a more tedious, uninteresting way, but nevertheless a kind of revival. And it's what I mean by the new paganism. So nature is still distant in the sense of physical nature. Very few of us, very little of the time, have much direct interaction with wilderness or even with tamed nature, such as farms. Nature is still distant. But unlike, let's say, 100 years ago, and to an important degree, even unlike 20 years ago, the direct experience of the outside world has been replaced by screens. So the nature that we have is essentially not just a screened-off nature, but a nature of the screen itself. The statistics will vary depending on where you look, but if the average American spends 7 hours a day in front of social media, and then an additional hours a day in front of screens at work. And then if you add automobiles and commutes into that, you're looking at most of the day, right? So that in effect becomes our nature, the things that we're looking at when we're not asleep. And our dreams have become much more boring as a result, but I'm gonna bracket that for another essay which Emily won't publish. So this is another nature, right? The computer and the car. And in this nature, hydrocarbons no longer mean control. We're still using them, but we're aware that the use of hydrocarbons doesn't allow us to control the earth. It's changing the earth in ways that we recognize and measure, might look away from, but involve loss of control, involve floods and fires and the melting of icebergs and so on. So hydrocarbons are still with us, but they now mean the loss of control rather than control. And incidentally, the digital, which distracts us from the hydrocarbon problem, makes it much, much worse. Because although we don't think about it, when we use digital technology, we're also burning hydrocarbons the entire time. And we're slipping into this weird moment where precisely because we're addicted to the digital, we can't break our addiction to the hydrocarbons. So that's the Umwelt, that's the notion of nature that I'm thinking about. And within that, let me now try to think about, in this third nature, what those 5 categories look like that I mentioned before. Language, the oracle, sacrifice, charisma, and value. So in the first nature, in this ideal typical paganism that I'm talking about, language is not so much about control. We're dealing with a society that is generally not literate. Language involves the celebration. Language involves solemnity. Language is around ritual. Poets use language to elevate and to honor a leader. But language is not something which generally allows for control. It's the Christians who use language, and especially written language, for control when they displace the pagans. In our world, in our familiar world, or the world that used to be familiar, language was used for control, whether that was controlled by priests or controlled by governments, or in some kind of ideal democratic situation, controlled by the people, thanks to literacy, which allows them to know what's going on around them. In our third nature, and this is the form the argument's going to take again and again, in our third nature, in our present, it's as though we're returning to the first nature, returning to a kind of pagan attitude towards something, in this case towards language. There's the obvious point of erosion of active vocabulary, thanks to digital technology, that digital technology generates for us a series of ritual phrases, which are known as memes. That it's also pretty obvious, I think, to most of us, that we are becoming illiterate, not just in the general sense, but in a very specific way. It's harder and harder for most of us to read things that we don't want to read. It's as though the language only works when it's in accord with the things that we already think, and that's a very different kind of language. It's a language which is beyond your control and which is in some sense controlling you. So a good example of this, by the way, which I noticed the other day, was the president's executive order on history, where he's essentially trying to decree that words about the past only be used in a kind of solemn mode to celebrate and to honor leaders of the present. So that's language. The oracle. I think we're living in a world of the oracle. I think we've now returned to the oracle. Let me try to make that case. So what is an oracle? An oracle is an invisible or mostly invisible, obscure, hidden source of knowledge. You, in some sense, know how the oracle works. You know how you're supposed to approach it and engage with it. But you know the formula that are relevant for summoning the oracle or for getting her words. But deeply, you don't know how the oracle works. And that's the whole point of an oracle, that there's some structure that's invisible to you that is producing the answers that you don't really understand. In a myth or in a story, a visit to an oracle or to a sibyl would be part of a life story. It'd be part of a larger mythological biography. Something's going on in your life, in your family's life, in your generational life, and so you seek out an oracle to try to resolve a problem. You're seeking truth, and then in general, the oracle tells you something a bit ambiguous, and you head off somewhere to do something. And the magic of the oracle, I think, is this, that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's why oracles are attractive. Like, it's an ambiguous formulation, and they send you off to do things, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's that tension, that uncertainty, which sends you back to the oracle the next time as well. In Scandinavia, and also among the Slavs, there was this very interesting practice before Christianity of horse divination, where you would keep a specific horse who you would not ride. You would specifically not ride this horse. The horse would be kept in its own structure, and then you would bring the horse out when you needed to divine the future. And depending upon how the horse trod and what the horse trod on, you would know whether it was a good time to plant or a good time to go to war or a good time to go off on a raid. This was apparently a very hard habit to break. There are a number of stories, or it's the same story really, reaching from what's now Ukraine all the way to England, of a person, a ruler, being told that he's going to be killed by his special divining horse. And so in order to avoid that fate, the ruler has the horse killed and buried. And then later on, the leader, walking across a field or a beach, happens upon a horse's skull and kicks it, or something of the kind, and a snake comes out of the eye of the horse and bites the ruler and kills him. And the point, I'm glad you like that story because it was a big hit in the 10th century. And so it seems like we're all here we're in the same time. That's good. That story functioned from England all the way to Kiev. So in that, you can read that story at one level as being about how you can't escape fate, but there's another level which is saying you can't escape the oracle. You keep coming back. You're drawn to the oracle to the point where you're killed in some way. Now, I want to note that our algorithms, or at least the ones in social media, the big addictive forms of social media, are also based upon animal behavior. The basic source of the addictive power of algorithms and social media are behaviorist experiments beginning in the middle of the 20th century. The addictive pattern of giving you what you want, then not, then yes, not, but not in a pattern, not predictably, that's addictive was learned by way of experiments on pigeons and rats and other animals, beginning, as I say, roughly 80 or 90 years ago. Those experiments formed the basis of American advertising, and then they form the basis of social media algorithms. They are why, when you're on social media, you think agree, trauma, right? Agree, trauma. That's by design. That's meant to hold you in so that you will look at advertisements. And again, that goes back to the animal world. This, of course, doesn't give you a mission. It doesn't send you off to do anything, usually. Eventually, maybe it does, like, for example, storm the Capitol. But in general, it doesn't. In general, it just holds you to the screen. There's not a journey involved. You don't have to go very far to find this particular kind of oracle. And so you see where I'm going with this. I believe that, I think there's a very open question about what your smartphone actually is. Of course, it's not a phone, right? Calling it a phone is a hilariously reductive and inappropriate euphemism, right? Your smartphone is not a phone. Whatever it is, it's not that. But what is it? And the case that I'm making here, as I'm sure you've understood, is it's an oracle. That the best definition of your phone is that it's an oracle. It is the digital oracle or the portable oracle, but it's an oracle that you take with you. And the behavior that it induces in you makes sense, not from an Enlightenment point of view, but it makes sense very much from a pagan point of view. And I want to push this point a little bit harder. We have a tendency to imagine that all of the things that we call technology are enlightening. And this is simply not true. Technology, if we use the word carefully, technology would always be something which makes us more capable. But we don't use the word carefully at all. We just use it to mean gadgets, including the ones that make us less capable. And I want to make the case again that your smartphone, it's not a phone. I also want to claim that it's not technology. At least not for most people most of the time, because I think for most people most of the time it makes us less capable. Now I know there are all kinds of exceptions and many of you use it very wisely, and I know you have to reach your kids at school, but grosso modo, we are all less capable than we were in 2010. Let's face it. Okay, I'm gonna give you 5 seconds to process that. And it's because, 10 years ago, it would have been 3 seconds. Okay. So the third category that I want to work through, thank you for laughing at the stupid joke, by the way. That shows me that there's still hope, because so long as you know that you're getting dumber, there's still hope for you. It's that moment when you're like, no, I'm not getting stupid. Then, yeah. Okay. Third category is sacrifice. So the end of human sacrifice is a classical threshold for moving into our kind of civilization. Whether it's the ancient Greeks in their stories like Euripides and Iphigenia, or whether it's half-true or quarter-true Christian stories of conversion of peoples in Europe and elsewhere, getting over human sacrifice into something else is a major threshold from what I'm calling the first nature into the second. But I want to pause for a moment again on the appeal of sacrifice. The appeal of sacrifice, it seems to me, has to do also with the unpredictable workings of sacrifice. That, like oracles, sacrifice has the characteristic. This is being recorded, so I want to make it clear that I'm not in any way advocating this practice. But human sacrifice has the appeal that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Right? Sometimes you win the battle afterwards, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes the weather turns, and sometimes it doesn't. And so you just, you need to keep trying and make sure you're doing the practice, make sure you're carrying out the ritual correctly. The other appeal of human sacrifice, or of any sacrifice, is that you're losing something of value. And the loss of value, may not seem to make sense if you still believe in interests and so on, but the loss of something of value is what makes the process itself meaningful, right? You've lost something that you cared about, which could be an animal, right? And the animal is very valuable, or it could be a child. But it's the loss of something which is valuable, which makes the process meaningful. So we know from some very interesting accounts of the Scandinavians, especially one by Ibn Fadlan, that of the significance of sacrifice for these people. Ibn Fadlan has this incredibly interesting first-person narration of what took place after a chieftain of the Rus. The Rus were the Scandinavians who made their way into northeastern Europe and eventually to Kiev. An account of what happened when a chieftain or an important trader of the Rus died. The process went on for days. There were various inclinations in the directions of divinities. There was a sacrifice in what was clearly a very practiced way of multiple species of animal. And in the end, the sacrifice of a slave girl. And in all of this, you have a kind of remarkable mixture of life and death and sex and marriage, because the young woman was thinking of herself as marrying the chieftain when she was sacrificed. Sobriety and intoxication, drugs were used by all, animals and humans all together. Hierarchy and mobility, he was very important, but mobility was also at play. And then there was also the question of quantity, that the chieftain was important, and so more things were sacrificed at the time of his death, so that he could go on. Now, I want to think about sacrifice in terms of our politics, in terms of our third nature. And I'm not going to claim that this is the only thing which is going on, but I think the dynamic where sacrifice makes things meaningful to us, and that where more people are judged, the importance of rulers is judged by how much is sacrificed to them, is salient to the way things are going now. Let me begin from a distant example for at least many of you, which is the war in Ukraine. Interestingly, I'm not sure how many of you caught this, but interestingly, Putin actually justifies the invasion of Ukraine by reference to what he does not know to be a pre-Christian Scandinavian colonial story, according to which Odin has 3 sons. This happens over and over again, by the way, the 3 sons business. It's a big Indo-European thing, the 3 sons. Odin has 3 sons. The 3 sons go off to colonize someplace, but they're not actually colonizing it because they were invited in. Those of you who know anything about what the Russians call their early history will recognize this story. It's the story which Putin used to invade Ukraine. It's quite extraordinary that he's actually referring to a pagan story from the period that I'm talking about. The war itself, I realize I'm jumping a million argumentative steps here, but the war itself is also clearly a war that involves, among other things, a sense of sacrifice. There have been about 1 million Russian casualties, which is quite a lot, and more than one I think can really justify by any notion of Russian interests, and I think even more than one can really explain by way of conventional political arguments like Putin is invested in the war and therefore can't lose. I think you can only get to this kind of war of destruction when you have a change in language, when you have a kind of oracle, which the Russians do, and also when you have a political dynamic of sacrifice. Okay, now let me try to bring it a little bit closer and talk about American domestic politics. In my books, I use the category of pseudo-populism, by which I mean shifting politics from a sense of everyone is going to gain something to a sense of there's going to be more pain, and the relevant political question is how that pain is going to be distributed. We're all going to hurt some, but the issue is who gets to hurt less and gets to watch other people hurt more. So it's a politics of voyeurism, it's a politics of sadism, and I think it's something that we are indulging in right now. I think in broadly speaking, the deportation policy is like this. We are watching other people be sacrificed, right? Those of us who are not an immediate threat, that is, are watching other people be sacrificed. And it is public, and it's deliberately public. It's not that the Trump people are deporting more people than the Biden people did. They're not. They're just doing it in a more deliberately spectacular fashion. Right down to and including the seizures on the street of graduate students. This is done not because it's necessary, it's not. They could just call them on the phone and tell them if they're going to revoke their visas, which is wrong, but if they're going to do it, they could then just send them a letter and an email saying we've revoked your visa. Abducting them on the street is an entirely unnecessary act of terror, but I think it's done in the spirit of giving people a sacrifice to watch. And of course, the spectacle of Kristi Noem in El Salvador is very much in the spirit as well, right? And so I'm happy to use the word fascism, and I think that's a very fascist moment. But in a way, what I'm doing in this talk is I'm trying to step back and ask what are the underlying human capacities which make fascism tangible and coherent and functional. And this may be very old-fashioned and Christian of me, but when I say the word El Salvador, I always think like, well, that means the Savior, and the Savior is Jesus Christ, and the whole idea of Jesus Christ was that was going to be the last sacrifice. That was the idea. In foreign policy, I think we can see very much the same thing. The Trump policy towards Ukraine is one of, I hope I am wrong, but I don't believe so, is one of sacrificing the country. The Trump policy towards Canada and Greenland, I think, is very much the same. It's a policy of letting things go and letting the Russians in. Incidentally, and I'm sure this is just incidental, Ukraine, Canada, and Greenland are all places that the Vikings explored at the time that I'm talking about. There is this funny sense that Putin justifies invading Ukraine because of Vikings. And now we're talking about our deep historical, I don't know if you've been following this, but the president released a video about our deep historical connection to Greenland, which is very much on the Putin model, right? But what would that deep historical connection be? Presumably the Vikings who landed in Canada, which is also our country or something. But I'm trying to make a serious point here, which is that there was until a few weeks ago, the Ukrainians had a perfectly reasonable chance of winning the war, and indeed were connected in a web of alliances. And that web of alliances went beyond Ukraine, obviously, into Europe and into North America. What the Trump administration is doing is that it's breaking the alliances, breaking the relationships, creating a world in which many things were possible that weren't possible before, but none of them is good. And none of them is actually in the interest of the United States. And I think in a way that's the point, that you can't actually justify any of this in terms of a conventional account of the interest of the United States, including, in my view, an imperial account. I think what is going on instead is a logic of sacrifice, of making things worse, which at its depth, it comes down to hero worship. Hero worship of Putin, hero worship of Musk, hero worship in a different way, I'll talk about this, of Trump. But the sacrifice, and now I'm going to make, this is the point which is going to really disqualify me, unless Emily is in a truly Zen mode. The deepest sacrifice is one that we are carrying out ourselves. And I think at some level, we know that we are carrying out. If I can go back to the war in Ukraine for a moment, another, I think, deeper analysis of the war in Ukraine is that this is a war by a hydrocarbon oligarch. The most important hydrocarbon oligarch in the world is precisely Vladimir Putin. And it's a war by a hydrocarbon oligarch, which is to preserve and to make permanent hydrocarbon oligarchy. It's a war which is a kind of forecast of how the world as a whole will look if we don't get over the threshold into solving global warming and instead have resource wars everywhere. This is the first in a series of resource wars all around the world on the logic that we're going to stay with hydrocarbons forever. But of course, if you stay with hydrocarbons, it's not a very long forever. Meanwhile, the biggest, or I think the most significant American supporter of Putin in his war against Ukraine is precisely the major digital oligarch and the only person who might be wealthier than Putin, and that is Elon Musk. And for me, there's something uncanny about this alliance of the digital and the hydrocarbon, especially when we take into account that it's the hydrocarbon plus the digital taken together which are physically destroying the world, making the world first much more unpredictable for all of us, and then eventually unlivable. But my point was going to be that there's a sense in which we're all very much involved in this. As we sacrifice our time to the oracle, as we burn the hydrocarbons, we are taking part in this larger sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of our children, our grandchildren, the possibility of life on Earth. We are, in that sense, like the young woman, right, who throws herself into the pit, who allows herself to be killed. We are taking part in this larger carbon sacrifice, and it's an enormous sacrifice of coming generations of the Earth itself. And of course, as we get into this dynamic, the Earth itself becomes the generator of unpredictability, right? And of course, it already is for many people around the world, and it's becoming so for more people around the world. Places like California or Southern California are more unpredictable than they used to be. America's coasts in general, the American prairie, much of America is less predictable than it was. We're bringing back to our own nature the kind of unpredictability or unmasterability which was characteristic of the first nature that I was talking about. We're bringing that back. Okay, so charisma. Newt Gingrich, No, I'm talking about something that Newt Gingrich said, which is correct. So you may not have caught this, but Newt Gingrich at one point referred to Trump as a character. He said Trump for something like this, I'm paraphrasing. Trump for his followers is like a hero out of a Viking saga. And I believe that that is absolutely correct. I believe that you cannot understand Trump without a sense of a certain kind of charisma. Now, as you might have noticed, one of the ways that I'm trying to make this fun, and it may be a very obscure kind of fun, is that I'm using Hegel, and I'm using René Girard, and I'm now using Max Weber. And this is enjoyable for me, but it's also meant as a kind of signal that this is the kind of thing that we have to do, right? We have to preserve the humanities, preserve the categories, look for big ways of understanding what's going on around us. So anyway, the charisma, Max Weber made the argument, very familiar, I'm sure, that there's charismatic leadership, which then gives way to a more ordered form of polity. And that the trick in forming what we might call a state is getting from charismatic leadership into something like predictable ritual or law. And the charismatic leader, of course, can rely on a world of sacrifice and oracles and obscure and ambiguous language. Whereas in order to get to that other thing, the institutions, the law, the predictability, you have to have language that functions in a different way, which is more impersonal. You have to have norms that make political and social life more predictable. So for Weber, there was a kind of magical transitional moment where you get from the rulers, like the Viking raiders, who have charisma, who have their retinues, who have a certain kind of very impressive capability, but who can't found a dynasty, who can't found a state. You need something else for that. And for many of them, by the way, that something else was precisely Christianity at the beginning. I think what we're seeing now is the reversal of that process. I think the charisma, the specific charisma that Trump has, is the reverse of that kind of Weberian charisma. It involves the project of taking institutions and making them disappear. It's a project of making things dysfunctional that might have been functional, right down to and including that basic issue of succession. Because, of course, the problem that the charismatic leader always has is who rules next, who preserves all of this, right? What comes next after me? And you solve that democracy has many virtues, but one of them is that you solve that fundamental problem of the continuity of the state. But Trump having a third term, or Trump ruling forever, means a very temporary United States of America. As if you break that solution, the solution of a succession, then you're also going to break the country. Now, in this charisma works in ways that are familiar, but also a little bit differently, right? So Trump is a very special object, and as I see it, a very special object of sacrifice. He is like a god of wealth. And like other gods of wealth, he is only wealthy because you give things to him, right? He didn't, like, the gods of wealth had goats and they had horses and cattle because you sacrificed them to him. Trump is like that. Like, Trump never really had any money. He was a god of wealth, right? He was golden in coloration and so forth, right? He presented as himself as a god of wealth, and it was the presentation as god of wealth which allowed him to, in fact, be wealthy, not the other way around, right? And let's admit, that's a very special sort of charisma, and eventually, it took him a long time, eventually that has worked. Eventually he does actually have money. But the charisma of this sort of figure, this sort of hero or anti-hero, involves offering another world, right? Another world which depends on a first nature kind of use of language, ambiguous, never certain, never connected firmly to reality, possibly changing, hard to interpret, which depends on an oracle, right? A truth social account, social media, things that make you upset or make you happy or both or one after the other. It depends on sacrifice. It depends on people being willing to hurt themselves and hurt others. And it depends, as I say, on charisma. So the story that Trump tells you, like with the help of all of this, the story, the alternative reality that he creates involves among other things, the electoral big lie, like the idea that he won in 2020. And that means that the people who were criminals in that coup attempt are now martyrs in this story. Incidentally, and not unrelatedly, Putin makes the argument that Russian soldiers who are killed are not only martyrs, but are literally reincarnated later on. So the coup criminals are martyrs. But we also see some interesting differences between the third nature and the first nature. An important one for me has to do with the cult of physical cowardice. So in the first nature, these men that I'm talking about, these slave traders, these heroes, these raiders, they may have had many, as we would see it, character failings, but they generally did exhibit physical courage, sometimes to a quite extraordinary degree. We no longer have that. We have the reverse. We have the cult of physical cowardice. We have performative masculinity, which lacks the performance of masculinity, right? It consists entirely in in the negative, in verbally demeaning, right? Verbally demeaning, harassing others, in summoning third parties to commit violence against, but what it doesn't involve is physical courage. And you can see this particularly in the discomfort that figures like Vance and Trump and Musk have around figures like Volodymyr Zelensky, right? They have a problem with actual masculine physical courage. It's very provocative to them because what they need is instead a cult of physical cowardice, where they are the top men precisely because by way of their verbal charisma and their aura, they can provoke violence in a kind of passive-aggressive sort of way. So that's one difference, and it's a serious difference, and it's an interesting difference because in the first nature, at least in the Scandinavian example, the people around the ruler, his retinue, or I like the word druzhina, which goes back to an even older concept from the Scythians. The druzhina is the group of friends, and the notion is that if the leader dies, you die. And when you die, you join the leader in the afterlife, right? So there's a very serious notion of men being around other men. That kind of thing is what we don't have in this third nature. We don't have a cult of taking risks, dying with. It's a cult of inaction, right? It's a cult of talking to, up to, around, submitting to the leader and helping the leader hurt other people indirectly, verbally, digitally. The second difference has to do, for me anyway, with the circulation of wealth. In the first nature, these charismatic leaders, they had, in the Scandinavian example again, armbands, right? The famous ring, like the ring that appears in Wagner or the ring that appears in Tolkien, in historical reality was actually an armband. And the armband was traded around or exchanged as a sign of loyalty and devotion to the ruler. And interestingly, it was not exchange value, it was entirely symbolic. So the Vikings, to incredible extent, would collect silver, but they wouldn't use it as a means of exchange. They would use it as a means of decoration, as a sign of loyalty, or they would use it to decorate themselves, both the men and the women, interestingly, very interestingly. But that's another subject. But that leads me to point 5. Which is not, by the way, that's another difference. I can't help but say this because I'm a human and I'm weak. Another difference is that the charismatic leaders of our first nature were very concerned with beauty. What they did with objects of value was extraordinarily beautiful, and they buried their men and their women, sometimes apart, sometimes together. Again, it gets very interesting with the Vikings. But they buried the people they cherished with beautiful and valuable things, to the point where I find it in a way shameful to compare the way that they could let valuable things go, and that we can't. But okay, close parenthesis. Fifth point is precisely value. So the Vikings collected silver for a couple of centuries from the Arabs, who were the great power at the time, in exchange for mostly slaves, as the Scandinavians don't like to say anymore because they're nice social democrats, but mostly slaves, to some extent furs and other goods. And the interesting thing, as I say, is that they didn't really use that silver so much for exchange. One of the striking things that they did with it, and I was pondering this when I was on the island of Gotland, where much of this and perhaps most of this silver has been found, is that they would bury the silver in hoards. They would just bury it. And probably the reason why they did this was because they believed that they could take it with them. That there was something called Odin's Law, which if it was beneath the earth, it was in Odin's realm, and then when you were beneath the earth, when you were dead, you could take it with you, right, to Valhalla. So this was a notion of immortality, right? These kinds of pagans believed that if they carried out acts of courage and died in the right way, they could be immortal. But it wasn't a literal, so this is something which has changed. We have the hoarding, right? This is the thing which is very interesting about our billionaires or multi-billionaires or centibillionaires. The terms are racing to catch up with the reality. When you have $100 billion, let's go crazy. I would even say when you have $50 billion, it's no longer about exchange value. It's no longer about what you can buy for that. It is about a pure symbol. It's about a competition among wealthy people. It's about symbols, and it's about living forever. And the striking thing about and it's hoarding. This is an interesting thing and a depressing one, but they can't give it away. They find it impossible to give it away, and so therefore they will die with it. They can't give it away. And we know this as a matter of fact because the Gates Foundation tries to get billionaires to pledge to give X percentage of their wealth away, and they simply won't do it. So they're going to die with it. So there's hoarding. But the notion of immortality is very different. The notion of immortality is much stupider. I mean, I think there is and I'm sure many of you have read these texts too, but I think there's a dignity and a complexity in the notion that you will be immortal because you have achieved immortal things, because of your deeds, right? Which is what Odin conveys. That the way to be immortal is to have done things that are immortal. Whereas we have the cartoonishly idiotic notion of immortality, which is that we are going to biologically live forever, which is something that nobody in the 10th century would have been stupid enough to believe, right? And this notion of immortality, the one with all the tubes and the chemicals and the vitamins and stuff, that notion of immortality, which is pretty widespread among the kinds of people that I'm talking about, this notion of immortality, interestingly, valorizes, if that's the word, valorizes not courage, but quite to the contrary, it valorizes cowardice. Because if you believe that you could physically live forever, then every day is a source of threat. And the only thing which really matters to you is staying away from the things that might put an end to your physical existence. Okay, so value is my fifth category. And here is then a very brief underview, and then we'll have a little bit of time, I hope, for questions. The argument that I've made here in talking about value and charisma and sacrifice and oracles and language is an argument about an Umwelt, about a change in environment. I've made a very broad, somewhat historical case about three historical stages. A first nature, a second nature, which we're losing, and a third nature, which is emerging. And the structure of that argument has been a kind of reverse Hegelian one, in which I'm saying that features from the first nature and features from the second nature are combining, not for some kind of lovely Aufhebung, but in fact for a sort of depressing decline, which has the worst features of both of the prior natures. That's been the shape of my argument. It has to do, and the causal force in this argument has to do with changes in the world around us. To some extent, we've made these changes ourselves, but it has to do with the kind of nature that we face. Do we face a nature of unpredictable agriculture, unpredictable raiding and hunting? Do we face a nature which has been mastered by agriculture and industry? Or do we face a nature which beyond us is out of control, but in front of our faces is controlling us, which is the third nature? So it's been a big, broad causal argument. But my closing underview is that we have made there's also an ideology of this. There's been an ideology which has made this more likely, and that is the notion, as I try to call it in my freedom book anyway, the notion of negative freedom. An argument which poses as enlightenment and as rationality, which has reduced humanity to the notion of means ends rationality. And in that notion of means ends rationality, what goes missing is humanity. Like what might be good, what might be a future worth having. And as power relations become more and more vexed and unfair, efficiency more and more means my ability to use you for my purposes. The word efficiency means I don't have to talk about my purposes. All I have to talk about is how you're going to run around faster in order to achieve those purposes of mine that I never have to name. And with that ideology has come terms like free market and even free speech, which have pushed aside the question of what would actually be good for us, what the virtues might actually be. And in this account of rationality, it's our job to race after the computers and to be more like them. Because, of course, the computers are very good at certain kinds of calculations. What they can't do is affirm virtues and live in virtues and think about unpredictable futures, which is what we could do and what we hopefully still would be able to do. In other words, these processes of the emergence of the digital oracle, if you're going to buy that phrase, and the carbon sacrifice, if you'll follow me that far, these processes have had their priests. And these priests have generally been telling us that they are pushing us further into enlightenment. And I think exactly the opposite has been going on. I think the case that has been made for what we tend to call rationality, or what we tend to call freedom, has actually been a kind of preparation for this third nature, for this return to humanism. So I'm going to, this rejection, sorry, of humanism. And that's where I want to close, because this is the Bob Silver's lecture. Whether you like this argument or not, or whether you buy it or not, and if all of you bought it, I would be very disappointed. I hope that at least at a basic level, what I've been able to show is that it helps to have the humanities. This argument that I've been, yeah, okay. This argument that I've made depends upon the work of archaeologists and literary scholars and historians and other people who work in the humanities and social sciences and sciences, but it's predominantly an argument of interpretation. We don't have the raw material for interpretation without the humanities. And so where I want to close is there. I hope this argument has brought you a little bit of understanding, at least of how I spend my free time, if nothing else. But also, I hope it's brought you a little bit of joy, because there is a joy in trying to understand difficult things, and we're going to need to face the difficult things squarely, but we're going to need to face them also with a bit of joy behind our eyes. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, I'm going to take the hard questions about, okay, let's see. I'm going to group all the hard questions about immigration. Let me just talk about that first of all, because I was very pleased that Emily introduced me in line with my position at the University of Toronto. I'm very pleased that I'm going to the University of Toronto. That was a decision that was made when quite a while ago, when I naively, because you can't be right about everything, but at a time when I believed that Kamala Harris was going to win the next election, and I was going to have much more time to write about paganism than in fact I have had. So I made the decision to go to Toronto for reasons which have to do with the attractions of Toronto at this stage of my career, with a desire to teach at a big public school, desire to teach at a public affairs school where I could do history to hundreds and hundreds of public affairs MA students. Also some things which had to do with my immediate family and with my family of origin. And it was a decision that I was very happy to make and that I made on positive grounds rather than negative grounds. So I realized that it's important to realize that different Yale faculty members have different stories, both in the stories they tell and the stories they're living. So Jason Stanley has told a story which is entirely true in his case of a very recent decision to go to Toronto. And so I want to say that that wasn't why I went. But I think he's entirely, his account is entirely right. It is perfectly reasonable to decide that you're going to leave an American institution of higher education and go teach in Canada or where else. And I think it's very important for people not to be judgmental about this, the argument that you need to stay and fight. I'll take that argument seriously from people who are actually staying and fighting, but in my experience, the people who have done a lot of fighting are also people who have passports and have spent time in other countries, and that pretty much goes without exception. So the other thing I was going to say about Toronto and about leaving is this: as you see, I'm physically right here in the United States of America. Where I teach is not going to change what my commitments are. Teaching in Toronto didn't prevent me from going to the front line in Ukraine, which is frankly a hell of a lot riskier than coming to a lecture at the New York Public Library, much as these questions are very difficult and challenging. It's not like I mean, it's touching that people are concerned about where I teach, but where I teach has always been a matter of luck, personal things, and basically private commitments. But it's not going to change what I do in the world, right? It's not going to change that. It's not that you're going to stop seeing me in the United States. It's not that there aren't going to be bountiful opportunities for me to be arrested, if that's what you're thinking about. That's going to be there. That's going to be there. So I mean, but since we're at the beginning of this conversation, I want to make this very clear. People are going to have reasons. Like, I didn't leave because of Trump. I left a long time ago, and I was testing Toronto out, and the reasons, like, it worked for my family, and that's why I'm staying. But people are going to leave, and they're going to have good reasons for leaving. And the fact that they've left doesn't mean that they're worthless and we all get to criticize them. A big problem in the American left, a big problem, is that we set upon our own with much greater energy than we set upon the other side. And so when you see people leave, and they will leave, people are going to leave. I mean, just as a historical sociological reality where the United States is now, people are going to go. They're already going, right? They're already going. I haven't had a single colleague thus far who, when they learned, thanks to Jason, that I was going to go to Toronto, every single one, either jokingly or seriously so far, has said, "Oh, can I go," right? And inside, and even when it's a joke, right? Even when it's a joke, there's something in it. Like, people are going to go, and when people go, you have to think, okay, how can that also be made useful, right? How can experiences from other countries be made useful? Insofar as I have been a useful commentator on the United States, it is not because I'm an American historian. I'm an American and historian, but I'm not an American historian. It's because I lived in other countries and worked on other countries and then came back to the U.S. On Tyranny was not the book written by somebody who had great experience in U.S. history. It was somebody who had certain intuitions having to do with the middle of the 20th century in Europe. And by the way, being more constructive about this, it is really important right now for American institutions to get advice from institutions in places like Ukraine and Poland and Slovenia, where there's been progress and regress, but where there's been success in coming back. We are our attitude, not yours, because I know you're all incredibly enlightened because it's in your public library, but our general attitude is that nothing like this has ever happened before to anyone, right? That's the starting point. Whereas in fact, the way that authoritarianism is progressing in the US is pretty generic. There isn't really that much which is special about it. And so that means that people who have experience in Ukraine or even in places where things haven't worked out, like Hungary, those people have valuable lessons. Brazil, right? And we have to be able to listen to that, right? So don't think, so when people leave America or they're not from America, that doesn't mean they don't have anything to say. It might mean precisely that there are things worth listening to. And let me comment, I'm just going to take the opportunity to comment on a larger issue of Columbia and Yale and U.S. higher education. Again, I'm not leaving Yale because of any terrible thing that Yale did or is about to do. But it is the case, in my view, that U.S. institutions of higher education are going to have to work together, like other institutions, like law firms. They're all going to have to work together, because if you don't work together, you get picked off one by one. This is, unfortunately, this is authoritarianism 101, that you break civil society by making an example of one part, of one institution, of one part of civil society, right? That's what you do, and that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. And you can't beat that logic by hoping that you're not going to be next. You have to preemptively band together, and you have to be aware that you're going to take a hit, that somebody's going to take a hit. You have to be aware of that, and when somebody takes a hit, you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared to help. And by the same token, universities have to speak up on behalf of their most vulnerable students and faculty, not which by the way, I'm obviously not talking about myself, right? When the vice president attacks me, I just assume that's like some kind of intramural Yale thing, which he hasn't sorted out yet. I don't mean me. I mean people who. You know who I mean. I mean graduate students from other countries. I mean faculty from other countries. But there's no use value in. So morally, obviously, you should. And I'm sure you're clapping for the morality, but practically it doesn't help you not to protect them. Because if you don't protect them, then they just go after the next class and the next class and the next class of people, right? You can't avoid that process by conceding. You can only accelerate it. Okay, was that okay on the whole, like immigration, higher education, Columbia? All right. Okay. Protect institutions. Yeah, got that. Yeah. Okay, there are a couple here about whether this is reversible. Can we convert the pagans back to normal? And you're describing a kind of a cultural era shift. Is this reversible? Ever happened before? So, three things to say here. The first is that I think we have to have a sense of the depth and the sources of the change in order to have a chance of getting out of it. I do believe that the changes in technology, or what I've called the changes of nature, are profound, and that we can't turn them into a positive without seeing them for what they are. And other people's accounts might use different terms for all of this, but I think we can broadly agree that the shift of hydrocarbons from a source of control to a source of chaos, and the shift in what we call technology from being something that is enabling to something that is being disabling are very fundamental shifts. And we have to see that for what it is before we can try to turn them. And of course we can, like at that level of the macro factors, we can of course turn them. It is of course possible. We could be in a world of wind and solar infusion already, and then you'd get positive feedback effects instead of the negative ones I've talked about. We could be in a world, and other countries are, right? Taiwan, for example. Taiwan is a really interesting example of how to manage digital politics, and the Europeans are also doing, in general, much better than we are. But you can handle the social media differently than how we are handling it. So you can get at the macro factors. That's the second part. And then the third part is, of course, we can't go back, right? You can never go back. I think you have to be able to imagine big changes for the better to get out of this. And this is what I tried to do at some length in On Freedom. You can't imagine like, okay, these are just like technical issues, we're going to get out of them. It's more, we have to solve these big issues, but also we have to be able to imagine an America or a world which is much better than the one we are now. And I'm doing this imaginative work here, partly because I know I can get away with it, but also partly because I'm trying to inspire like imagination about how things could be different than they are. Because one of our traps is that we see the way things are now, and we're it's over and over and over again, negative stimulus, negative stimulus, negative stimulus. In order to imagine how things can be better, you have to have big imaginative categories about how they went wrong. And then once you have those big imaginative categories of how they were wrong, then you can kind of use those categories or deploy them to think about how things could get better. Okay, one more. Most of these questions are about, okay, so like there are two kinds of cards in here. They're like the, why are you going to Toronto? And then they're like, and then they're when can I go to Toronto? I'm not, these are the two when can I go to Toronto cards. Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to repeat the stuff I said before, but there are several questions here about when to go, and so I do want to take that question seriously. I already made the point about respecting other people's decisions and trying to realize that there's actually much to be gained by immigration, which historically speaking there is. Like the revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe had everything to do with people who had immigrated and came back. There are a lot of recent examples of that, very positive examples of immigration to the United States, helping other countries and vice versa. But on this should I stay and should I go thing, there's no okay, so it's going to be personal. One has to respect it. My view is that everybody, I mean, you probably all have passports. Everybody should have a passport, and everybody should have their own line and set that line and then listen to it. Because when that moment comes, you're not going to feel like it. You're going to say, okay, it's hard to sell my house or whatever. And that's what people always do. Like they say, I'll leave when X happens. But when X happens, you say, well, my real estate agent is busy or my kid hasn't finished school. You have to decide, this is a lesson from 1930s, and I'm trying to be very serious about it. Like this is the one thing I know something about. You have to set the line for yourself, and then when that line is crossed, you have to go. And so now is the time to think about what the line is for you personally. I can't answer these questions in the form that they're put. I can't tell you personally when you should go, which is what's being asked of me here. But that's as much as I can say. And what do we do if our country invades another country like Canada? I don't think that's a laugh line at all. And it's interesting, right, to be in Canada now, because, how to put this politely, I haven't been in Canada long enough to put this politely. Okay, from the point of view of pretty much every other country, including countries that tend to be sympathetic towards us and respect us, the way that we are generally behaving is incredibly submissive. So one thing which is interesting about the Canadians is that one doesn't have to have the same kinds of conversations with them as one has to have with, forgive me, New York Times reporters, but like New York Times reporters. Like one doesn't have to go through the on the one hand, on the other hand stage of the conversation, which has become very, as somebody who was, I've been working on Trump for a long time. I've been trying to explain these things for a long time. I've put a fair amount of energy, sweat, time into trying to get across the threat of Trump for a long time, and I've been confronted, again and again and again with the, well, yes, but on the other hand, or is it really this, and shouldn't we wait to see if it's really this? And the problem with the shouldn't we wait to see is that by the time you wait to see, we're already on to the next thing, and then the next thing happens, and we say, shouldn't we wait to see? And it just goes on indefinitely like that. The thing that I called Trump's charisma, which is very real, he's very talented in his own way. He's also very intelligent in his own way. The thing that I called Trump's charisma generally does not work at all beyond the United States. And it's that charisma which allows us to ask the question, well, is it really that? Because a lot of Americans will say, no, it's not really that. And then when it is that, they say, hooray. But because they say, because opinions are divided in the US, then the American press, with its both sidesism thing, has to respect that and has to ask. By the way, I wrote an entire article about how both sidesism is, in fact, an ancient pagan belief. So, if you like, which the New York Times did not accept. I loyally submitted it. Now I'm never going to be published by the New York Times. So I've ruled out all my New York publishing outlets in this one lecture. It's all gone. Which answers the question, why Toronto? Yeah. Okay. But so the Trump charisma doesn't work beyond American borders. And so if you're in, and I'm like, I spend a lot of my time beyond American borders, right? This year for me was largely Ukraine, Europe, some time in the Midwest, some time in Canada. And what pretty much every other country has in common is that nobody looks at what's happening in the US now and says, oh, let's wait and see. right? Even the Canadians, who generally give us the benefit of the doubt, which we don't deserve. But even the Canadians are quite categorical, with a few exceptions, but they're quite categorical about what's going on. They're treating it as what it is, and there's a great value to that, right? Like, so the question, like, what should we do if we invade Canada? I'm going to make a minor suggestion, which is, like, take a trip to Canada and talk to some Canadians about it. Right? Because that's where the reality starts to sink in. Like, we know we're not bad MAGA people. We know that Canada's a real country. We know that Canadians are different and so on. We know they live 4 years longer than we do. They have a better time doing it. Some of them speak bad French. Some of them speak weird French. We know all these things, right? We know. There was a lot of laughter from the Canadian front row on that one. I brought in a few Canadians to see how these lines would work. We know those things, but do we really know them? Like, have we actually listened to Canadians in this particular moment? And that's a starting point for the answer, like, what do we do if the United States is going to invade Canada? Because there are people not very far from here geographically who are making very practical preparations for that eventuality. Like, as an American, I think there are conversations to be had about what a legal order is. There are conversations to be had now about the kind of rhetoric we're using towards Canada, which is shockingly similar to the rhetoric that Putin used before the invasion of Crimea in 2013, 2014. This whole business of it doesn't really exist, deep historical connections, borders are artificial, and so on. They don't know their own national identity. They speak 2 languages. That's very suspicious. All of that is Putin. That's all Putinism. It all leads in a certain direction. Or the notion that we're putting tariffs on Canada because of fentanyl, right? These things are deliberately absurd. They are meant to test whether people will go along with rhetoric, which is obviously meant to prepare us for war. And so one of the things you need to do before we get to the stage of invading Canada is to break up that propaganda. Not just to mock it, but not just to say, oh, it's not true, but to mock it, to break it up, so that people who would be involved in that invasion on the American side will realize how ridiculous it is when we talk about fentanyl or about an artificial border or something like that. Okay, then should I stop? I should stop? Okay, I'm going to stop. No? No? Okay, there was one Canadian in the front row, and she told me to stop. Now, the important thing is, did that make you mad at Canada? Don't let yourselves be drawn in, right? Okay. So I'll answer the last classic question, which is, how do you reach friends and family who voted for Trump? Which is that's the question I've been asked privately and publicly continuously, and it's really hard, and I do know how it is personally, and I have 2 very short answers to that. The first is, realize that you never, ever persuade people in a one-off conversation. It simply never happens, and you can't set out to converse with people on that basis. The second point is, try to find a way in the conversation for them to remember that you're a human being, and that your concerns are human concerns, that they don't just have to do with DC or something different or Trump himself, but that they have to do with something normal, human, everyday, so that they, even if they don't agree with you, which they won't, but that they will remember that you're a human being. Because if they remember you're a human being, if you can achieve that, then there is some chance that your argument later on will sprout. That's as good as it can get. And so keep up the human contact. Help them remember that you're human. Don't hope for too much, but keep at it. That's really, that's what I've been doing, and it's the best advice that I really have on these questions. I just want to say I appreciate these questions. I appreciate the chance to talk more directly about contemporary things than I did in the talk. I also hope that the talk gave you something to go away with, and I have to say again, I'm really delighted to be here at the New York Public Library and to give the Silvers Lecture. This has been a great honor. Thank you for being here.